All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. So, like Jen said, my name is Justin Cook. I'm from the Birmingham Museum, and this is yet another entry in our ongoing series here at the library, or I guess it might be more appropriate to say with the library, not exactly at the library, where we're giving talks that tie back to our current exhibit that we're showing here at the museum, which is called A Tapestry of Birmingham, Exploring Our Diversity. So, this month and tonight, we'll be looking at how immigration shaped Birmingham. And now, right off the bat, you're probably wondering, like, what exactly do I mean by that? And that's a good question. It's not exactly a broad, it's not exactly a specific statement. It's pretty broad. And well, as we all probably already know, America as we know it today was quite literally built by immigrants. Unless you are a Native American person, you are pretty much only here today because at some point you yourself or somebody in your family's history was an immigrant who came to this country for whatever reason. Now, it's important to know that when making a big life-changing decision such as this, such as moving to another country, people don't tend to do these things unless they have a reason to do it. You don't just really see people doing that on a whim. And while everyone has had or has their own personal reasons for immigrating from one country to another, when we take a broader look at US history, we actually see that certain political and economic world events have led to literal waves of immigration here into the United States and Canada. And where you see lots of people moving at once, leaving their old lives in another country and beginning anew here. So, if you're thinking that it sounds like a bold move to try to recount all of the different world events that could have caused these spikes in immigration over the past 250 years of US history, you would be absolutely correct. And I'm happy to tell you that I'm not going to try to fit all that into the next hour. So, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on Birmingham specifically, and we're going to see if any of these immigration waves in the past have had a tangible effect on the town of Birmingham throughout its nearly 200-year history. So we're going to start kind of big, and then we're going to slowly whittle our way down and see how things have affected Birmingham. So, jumping right in, we are going to start in mid 19th century Ireland. And to put it mildly, the mid to late 19th century was not exactly a good time to be living in Ireland for most people. There was severe political instability in the country that led to lots of civil wars that had a lot of blood being spilt in the country. And alongside all of that, the period of time from roughly 1845 to 1852 was plagued by the infamous Great Potato Famine of Ireland. And this saw mass starvation spread across the island. And it was estimated to have reduced the population of the country by roughly 2 to 3 million people. And deaths directly from this famine accounted for as many as 1 million people, while that remaining 2 million, and that figure I mentioned just a moment ago, would be people that would leave Ireland in favor of another country. And really, those numbers kind of only account for that 7 year period from 1845 to 1852. And the true scale and impact of the famine and the bloodshed in Ireland at this time is practically immeasurable. It's really hard to get a concrete number on it. And many people would have been thrown into a really horrible economic landscape, and it would have caused millions of people to take a leap of faith and try to start a new life in another country over the coming decades. And one such Irish immigrant who did exactly that was a man by the name of James O'Neill. And he came and settled in Ontario, Canada, though the exact date of when he did this is not really clear. It's most likely sometime in the mid to late 1850s. But at some point, James married a woman named Savilla Thompson, and the two of them in 1862 saw the birth of their first child, who was named Edwin O'Neill. And it's young Edwin here who would eventually make quite a name for himself in a certain small village in southeastern Michigan. Now, unfortunately, we don't really have much information on the early life of Edwin, specifically his time growing up in Canada. However, what we do know is that by 1855, where he would have now been an adult, he had moved to the United States and he had settled here in Birmingham, which at the time was a fairly small village that was surrounded by vast expanses of farmland. So you might be wondering, well, why would Edwin have chosen to live here in Birmingham if it was just this tiny little place that wasn't really anything super significant? And well, we can't really say for certain why exactly he came here to live in Birmingham. There are several things that we can point to that we believe could have impacted his decision to come here. So the first thing was the Great Depression. Sort of. Now, when you hear me say the Great Depression, you're probably thinking of that period of time in American history from about 1929 to 1939, where infamously, it was not a great time to be living here in America. The economy wasn't exactly in tip-top shape. But that's actually not the period of time that I'm talking about here. Before we came to know this decade in the 20s and 30s as the Great Depression, there was actually another period in American history that held that esteemed title. And it all really began with a little event known as the banking panic of 1873. And basically, what happened here was hundreds of banks across the country failed, which caused thousands of businesses to go under as a result. And this, like, original Great Depression, for lack of a better term, I guess, was really only one piece of a larger global recession that caused roughly 2 million Canadians at the time to come here to the United States in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And young Edwin O'Neill at the time most likely was one such person living in Canada who got swept up in this wave of people. And he probably came here to the United States to look for a better economic opportunity than anyone that he could have found in primarily rural area of Ontario, Canada. And with Birmingham being situated directly, well, actually almost directly at the midpoint between Detroit and Pontiac, which were already industrial and commercial centers at that time, and also being connected to both via railroad, Edwin could have found that better economic opportunity that he was looking for. Now, that's the economic side of the story. But another factor that could have influenced Edwin's decision might have been a little bit more cultural. So by 1855, Birmingham was actually already home to several families who had either recently immigrated here from Ireland or were only one or two generations removed from Ireland. And generally speaking, when people are making big life-changing decisions like this and moving to another part of the world or another country, they tend to really associate themselves with people who share similar values and similar cultural backgrounds because it provides a bit of a sense of comfort. And it's possible that the small but already established Irish community here in Birmingham gave Edwin a sense of familiarity in a place that would have, I mean, quite literally been completely foreign to him otherwise. So, whatever the reason for Edwin coming to Birmingham, now that he was here, well, he has to really figure out what he's going to do. He needs to carve a life out for himself. And well, how is he going to do this? I will get there in just a couple minutes. I don't want to spoil a surprise right off the bat because I really like holding people in suspense for absolutely no good reason. So remember just a moment ago how I mentioned how Birmingham was connected to Detroit and Pontiac via a railroad system? Well, this system was actually known as the DUR, or the Detroit United Railway. And on the left of the screen now, you can see a basic map of the railway's path that it would take between Detroit and Pontiac. And you can clearly see that it serviced communities such as Highland Park and Ferndale, and of course, Birmingham. Now, while there were many people who enjoyed the utility and convenience of that railroad system here in southeastern Michigan, there were also a lot of people who did not have access to these railroads. And most notably, I mean, if you just imagine this overlaid on a map of Michigan, anybody who was living just a few miles to the east or the west of Woodward Avenue. Because, really at this time, these surrounding communities such as Troy, Bloomfield, and Southfield, they were basically just landscapes made up of huge expanses of farmland with pretty low densities of people. I mean, it's not exactly what I would call prime time real estate for a railroad station. You're not exactly going to have to build a station at every single person's house. It's just not realistic. So as a result, the village of Birmingham actually sort of naturally turned into this, so to speak, downtown for some of these rural communities. And the main method of transportation that people would use to get from these farmland areas into Birmingham, they would have used horses. And if you know anything about horses, horses require a lot of equipment And I'm not going to get too deep into that because the piece of equipment for a horse that we are concerned with tonight is the horse harness. And the important thing to know about a horse harness is there is no such thing as a one size fit all size for this piece of equipment because, like people, horses are no horse is identical. They all come in all different shapes and sizes. Now, coincidentally, Edwin O'Neill was a skilled leather worker, and you can probably see where I'm going with this. So he would use this skill as a leather worker to open a business, and in this business, he would make and sell leather harnesses for horses of all shapes and sizes. And the shop was originally located in a freestanding one-story building here in Birmingham, but as time went on and the business changed and expanded, he eventually built a brick building located at what is today the address of 108 South Old Woodward. That building is actually still there today. Now, while Edwin's shop was quite successful dealing with horse harnesses, the 1890s saw the invention of another form of transportation and also the popularization of that form of transportation. And that was known as the bicycle. And with this increasing number of bicycles that were popping up everywhere on Birmingham streets, there came an ever more increasing demand for somebody who could repair those bikes. And if you have a bike that's in need of repair, who are you going to call? That's right, it's our boy Edwin O'Neill again. Kind of. So Edwin actually hired a man named Cap Huffman to work in his shop, and Cap Huffman was the one who was working as the shop's designated bicycle repairman. Not to say that Edwin himself didn't know how to fix a bike, but officially speaking, Cap Huffman was the man for the job there. And this resulted in the photo that you actually see on the left of your screen now, which is from 1896. It shows Edwin O'Neill's harness maker shop with a funny little, in my opinion, a funny little ad tacked on in the window on the left that says bicycles repaired. So you can say one thing about Edwin O'Neill's business, it's that he is not afraid to adapt to the times. So before we move on time-wise, I'm just going to give you a quick visual as to where exactly the shop was. So this is a 1910 map of Birmingham, and this is showing the intersection of Maple and Woodward Avenue. Today, this is actually Maple and Old Woodward. So quick shout out again to the Woodward, Old Woodward confusion. I always like to shout that out once every presentation because that historically has never created any problems, as we know. So as you can see, the harness shop highlighted right there in yellow, it was located pretty much directly in the center of Birmingham at the time at 108 South Woodward. So moving forward a bit to the 1910s, we would see O'Neill's business lean into yet another new form of transportation. Yes, of course, I'm talking about the automobile. Now, at the time, the automobile was this new and exciting piece of technology that everybody wanted because you can go wherever you want in this giant machine. And but unfortunately, just like with many forms of popular technology, it forced a lot of people to confront problems that, quite frankly, had never existed before. And O'Neill's shop would try to address some of these newfound problems. So one of the main ones being that given the fact that many early automobiles were like open and they didn't really have windows or overhead protection of any kind, and also that roads at the time were mostly still made of dirt, these early vehicles would kick up tremendous amounts of like dust and debris and dirt, and it would make passengers and drivers have their vision obscured and their clothes would get all dirty. So O'Neill took the initiative on this problem and began selling accessories in his shop, like things such as lap blankets, goggles, and gloves, as well as long duster coats. And by 1915, the shop had even began selling tires and among other automobile parts. Now, excuse me. Now, while Woodward eventually did become paved in 1916, then later expanded and widened again in the 20s, it would take a while for some of the other roads in the area to receive the same treatment. I mean, in fact, even today, not every road is paved. So I'd venture to guess that, O'Neill's business decision concerning the automobile really paid off for him. And in 1927, after about 42 years of business, Edwin O'Neill entered a well-deserved retirement, and he actually sold his building at 108 South Old Woodward. And like I mentioned, it still stands there today. And Edwin himself passed away in 1954 at the age of 92. And as you can imagine, he left behind a Birmingham that was, to put it mildly, much, much different than the one that he first came to in 1885. But the story of Edwin O'Neill and his shop here in Birmingham, it kind of highlights this idea that you'll see pop up in this presentation tonight of, one person's decision to immigrate from one country here to the U.S. Had a pretty significant effect on Birmingham when it all at the end of all things. And we also see that a little bit in our next subject, which is sees us moving over into Eastern Europe in around the about the similar time frame. And specifically, the area of Eastern Europe that we're going to be talking about here is the area that was once known as the Russian Empire. And we're going to be looking at how the Jewish community was treated at the time. Now, historically speaking, the early 1800s and actually, well, the 19th century, almost pretty much as a whole, was not a good time to be living in the Russian Empire if you were a Jewish person. And this starts off strong in the beginning of the 1800s because the Russian Empire had enacted a lot of laws that were outright discriminatory against Jewish people, and including things but not limited to not allowing them to live in big cities and also just not allowing them to participate in politics in any way whatsoever. And while at first some of these laws actually began to be eased up upon as the decades went on, there were complications with this, most notably, as was the case with many countries in this period in human history, there were a lot of progressive groups who were continually pushing for more and more change. And unfortunately, sometimes this led to violence. And as a result, unfortunately, over time, a popular conspiracy theory had emerged, and it basically placed Jewish people as the puppet masters, so to speak, of some of these progressive groups. And this idea really only worsened in 1881 when Tsar Alexander II was assassinated. And it was discovered that one of the convicted conspirators in that assassination was, in fact, Jewish. So as a result of this, Jewish people had many of their rights stripped away, and Jewish businesses in the area were severely hampered. And also, the assassination of the Tsar sparked waves of targeted riots against Jewish people, Jewish homes, and Jewish businesses. And these riots came to be known as pogroms. Excuse me. And in many cases, these acts of violence were not only supported, but also encouraged by local officials and law enforcement. So if you were a Jewish person living in this area at the time and you were a victim of one of these riots, you really had nowhere you could go to turn to for help. And so this open hostility towards the Jewish community was a major factor that drove nearly 2 million Jews to leave the area and come here to the United States from the time period of about the 1880s until 1914. And that leads us into our next subject for tonight, the Levinsons and Levinson's department store. So Morris Levinson was born in Latvia in 1872 as the son of Isaac Levinson and Hannah Blumberg. Now, Latvia at this time was under the control of the Russian Empire. And during the 1880s, this specific Jewish family was moving around in the area a lot, not really sticking to one spot for too long. And eventually they took the plunge and they made their way here to the United States. They eventually settled in 1888 here in Bay City, Michigan. Now, by just a couple years later, by the early 1890s, Morris himself had actually begun working here in Detroit. So he's already well on his way to becoming a true Michigander, and he hadn't really been in the country for 5 years. But coincidentally, in 1872, the very same year that Morris was born, another Latvian couple who went by the names of Mordecai and Bessie Fellhender saw the birth of their daughter, who was named Augusta Fellhender. Now, she would go by the nickname Gittel, so that is what I'm going to call her here tonight. So by 1890, Gittel had immigrated to the United States. But however, unlike Morris, she actually came alone. And sadly, she would never see her mother and father ever again after she came here to the United States. And when she came here, she spoke no English, and the only other person that she knew here at the time was an older brother of hers named Malka, and this older brother was living in Detroit at the time. So that's how Morris and Giddle both separately ended up coming here to Detroit. But it's unclear exactly when the two of them first met one another. But what we do know is that by 1893, they had gotten married. And the photo that you see on the right of the screen here is actually their wedding portrait. And this is actually part of our collection here at the Birmingham Museum. So it's actually kind of unclear what Giddle was doing for work during this time, but what we do know is that Morris was working as a peddler. And if you don't know what a peddler is, it's basically a traveling salesman who would go from community to community selling various goods to the locals in said communities. Sometimes they would even go house to house selling different things. And local peddlers at the time tended to actually form fairly close bonds with their customers. And sometimes they would even stay overnight in the homes of some of their customers on particularly long trips. So this is what Morris was doing. And Morris himself actually later recalled that a Birmingham resident by the name of Alex Purdy had urged him to settle in Birmingham and do away with the traveling salesman bit and sort of open up a permanent storefront in the town. Though there was some initial difficulty acquiring a property, eventually the Levinsons did acquire property in Birmingham, and they opened their first storefront in 1896 on the south side of Maple Road, just a little bit to the east of Woodward Avenue. And subsequently, Giddle and Morris became the first Jewish family to live here in Birmingham. And fast forward about 2 years, due to some structural problems with the building that they were operating the store out of, they actually decided to scrap that building and they built a new storefront on the northeastern corner of Woodward and Maple. And that building is actually still there today. I'm sure you've seen it up on the screen already. Yes, the building that used to have the Levinson's department store is currently occupied by the Starbucks in the middle of Birmingham. So it still sees a lot of foot traffic even to today, the 11th of January, 2024. So, but back to Levinson's department store. So by 1905, there were actually about five different stores, so to speak, inside of this one business. And that's basically why it became known as Levinson's department store and also Birmingham's very first department store. And um, so today we don't really tend to look at department stores as anything really close to resembling a revolutionary concept. It's kind of just a place you can go to every week to buy your groceries or really whatever else you want. But before America entered this era where you can find like a Walmart, a Meijer, or a Target at basically every corner in every town, shopping would entail a lot of trips to various stores and required a lot of walking around and being out in the elements. Like if you wanted shoes, you had to go to a specific store for shoes. If you want cheese, you have to go to a specific store for cheese. If you want dry goods, you're going to a separate place for that. So it involved being outside a lot. And, winter in Michigan, actually, not even just winter in Michigan. Sometimes it's not great being outside for that long in this area of the United States. But department stores like Levinson's actually offered incredible convenience by providing everything, or at least most of what you would need in one place, as well as admittedly providing a bunch of stuff that you definitely don't need. But that's besides the point. Now, a son of Morris and Giddle would later go on to say that they had actually started selling things such as like groceries and clothes to like furniture and candy. So they had a very wide range of things that they sold in this department store. And at this time, in like the 1890s and early 1900s, department stores really generally could only serve their purpose in large communities where they had access to a lot of potential shoppers. And in the 1890s, Birmingham really had only about 1,000 residents. So on paper, it wouldn't seem like a great place to open up a department store, at least by today's standards. It probably wouldn't. But thanks to things like the DUR, like I mentioned earlier, there were always many, many more people coming through Birmingham every day, either coming from Detroit or coming from Pontiac. And fortunately for the Levinsons, Birmingham continued to expand year after year, and it allowed their business to thrive. Now, Morris continued to run the store until his retirement in 1926, and the store remained in business for several more years after his retirement. Now, Morris passed away in 1954, and Giddle passed away as well in 1957, and both of their obituaries were published in the Birmingham Eccentric. And it was very clear that they were well loved in the community at this time. Now, you would think that this would be the end of the Levinson story here in Birmingham, but it really isn't. In fact, it's not even close to the end of their story here, because some of the descendants of the Levinson family have made quite a name for themselves in the past, 100 years. Some of them have become very heavily involved in the American political system. Some as recently as last year, Andy Levin served in the House of Representatives and just finished a term in 2023. So just put it into perspective how recent we're talking. And some of the Levinson descendants would also go on to become lawyers. And in fact, the Levinson family, still owns the Horton building in downtown Birmingham. And today, that building houses the addresses of 142 to 146 West Maple Road. Now, it's important for me to stress right now that the full extent of the Levinsons' legacy, not just in Birmingham, but in the state of Michigan as a whole, it goes much deeper than I'll be able to cover here tonight. So if you do want a deeper dive into the story of the Levinsons, especially considering their descendants, I highly recommend going to our YouTube channel, because there you can find a previous presentation about the Levinsons that was given by our museum director, Leslie, in March of last year. But so that's basically what I have for the Levinsons for you tonight. But moving on, these two stories that I've just shared with you here tonight, the story about the Levinsons and Edwin O'Neill and his harness shop, these are pretty much textbook examples of how certain people who were caught up in some of these mid to late 19th century immigration waves ended up finding their way to Birmingham and subsequently having a pretty impactful role to play in the development of the town. But for our last section here tonight, I'm gonna take a bit of a different spin on that topic of immigration. And to do that, we need to just jump into World War I for a little bit. And just a side note, World War I tends to be a period of time in not just American history, but world history that tends to be overshadowed a lot, thanks in no small part to the much grander extent of the sequel to it in the 1930s and 40s. But specifically here in World War I, we're going to take a look at how the war affected German immigrants who were here in the United States at the time, as well as some of the descendants of German immigrants who had come to the United States before the war began. And we're going to see if any of these effects actually played out here in Birmingham, if we have any examples we could pull from. And if you're reading the title of the slide that's on your screen now, you could probably guess if that's a yes or a no. So really quick, some background on World War I, otherwise known as the Great War. It famously began in the summer of 1914 with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary while he was on a visit to Sarajevo. And just to go through this really quick, his death prompted, what was at the time the nation of Austria-Hungary to declare war on the Kingdom of Serbia. And that basically snowballed through various political and military alliances and treaties into a much, much bigger conflict than anybody had bargained for in the entire world. And while many people cite the assassination of Franz Ferdinand as the start of World War I, It was more of the catalyst that led to other events that really sparked the war to officially begin. For instance, Germany quickly rose up as one of the primary aggressors in the conflict, and uh, they began invading their neighbors. They invaded Belgium and Luxembourg. Now, the United States famously tried to remain neutral and keep themselves out of the war for as long as possible, essentially adopting it's not our problem type of mindset. And we would then go on to recycle this for World War II, and it had basically the same effect. But that's besides the point. So fast forward to about 1915, and there was a very notable shift in public opinion on the war with the American public. And this was a result of the sinking of a British passenger liner that was known as the Lusitania. Now, the Lusitania was sunk by a German submarine, or at the time they were known as U-boats. And with the sinking of the Lusitania, it resulted in the death of over 120 Americans. And so this was a big thing in America at the time. People were not happy about this. And while the nation did technically remain neutral for nearly 2 more years, it was very clear that there was a lot of built up resentment towards Germany and subsequently German people here in the U.S. And it eventually led to the U.S. cutting ties with Germany in February of 1917, and then the actual declaration of war came just a couple months later in April of 1917. So I have just thrown a lot of exposition at you about World War I, and you're probably wondering right now, what does this have to do with Birmingham? So we're going to get there in just a moment, so just hang with me for a second. So as a result of the open hostility between the two countries, there was a very large wave of anti-German sentiment that swept throughout the country. And most famously, this manifested in the names of things like schools, towns, streets, and various foods, as well as certain family names being changed in order to sound less Germanic. Now, in terms of family names, I can actually relate to this a little bit because you saw my name up there at the beginning on the top of the presentation. My name is Justin Cook, but my last name is spelled Koch. And now, while I don't know for certain if my family changed the pronunciation of their name because of maybe something like this, after doing the research on this, it does seem like a very real possibility. And so I can thank somebody in my family 100 years ago for changing my pronunciation of my last name. So I now have to explain it to literally every single person that I ever meet. But keeping in line with something that we can probably see as a little bit humorous, hamburgers were famously renamed to Liberty sandwiches, and sauerkraut was changed to be called Liberty cabbage. Frankfurters came to be known as Liberty sausages. So in case you can't tell, we basically would just generalize the name and put the word liberty in front of it, which in my opinion is impossibly lazy, but it's so lazy that looking back, I think it's really funny. And in my opinion, creativity wasn't exactly our strong suit in that department. Now, while in my opinion, at least, that is pretty funny, the rest of the story really isn't funny. So at this time, the recent German immigrants who were here, as well as people with very obvious Germanic heritage, were practically forced to assimilate further into American culture. I mean, in fact, the propaganda that was being shown in the country at the time essentially boiled it down to, you are either German or you're American. You can't be both. You can't be German American. You have to pick one. And if you pick German, then we don't like you. So that was basically how they would sum it up. And many people took this very seriously, and they would distance themselves from their Germanic heritage, their Germanic roots. And anybody who may have remained proud of their heritage probably would have kept that detail to themselves in order to, avoid any unwanted harassment or perceived association with a country that was now quite literally seen as the enemy of the United States. And we actually see an interesting example of this play out here in Birmingham with the town's old local newspaper, the Birmingham Eccentric. So near the end of 1914, the Birmingham Centric actually began running a section that was written entirely in German, and they would recount the most prevalent news stories of that particular issue, just written entirely in German. And as you can see, they would use a very distinct looking font, and it would set it apart from the rest of the paper. And you can see on your screen, I have the full page of one of the issues of the Birmingham Eccentric. That's page 2 of the February 2nd, 1917 edition of the Birmingham Eccentric. And outlined in yellow, that's the entire German section. And you can see it takes up a pretty good amount of real estate on the page. Like that's about like 25% of one page of the newspaper. So, it wasn't really something that was just tacked on there at the end. Like this was something that there was real effort put into this. And you can see that each time the newspaper published a section in German, they would put this little disclaimer at the top of it every time on the right side of your screen. So now, if I could read it in German, I would love to read it out to you out loud in German. Unfortunately, I don't speak a single word of German, and I'm not going to attempt to do it today. So I'll just read it to you in English. So that translated into English, that says, "This department is for those family members who wish to read German." And this section of the newspaper actually persistently appeared for about 2.5 years. And the final German section of the Birmingham Eccentric was printed on February 2nd, 1917. So that very same one that you see on the left of your screen right now, that was the last time that it appeared. And now remember that date, February 2nd, 1917, because there's a very, very specific reason why this was the last issue of the newspaper that had this. And that would be because on February 3rd, the very next day, the United States officially cut diplomatic ties with Germany, and subsequently, the German section of the Birmingham Eccentric would vanish without a trace from all future issues of the publication. And this pattern of actions was actually fairly commonplace among newspapers in the country that ran sections similar to this, where they would write something in German, or even entirely German newspapers here in the United States. And you can probably see why it quickly became a thing that people would want to do away with, because it would have been a bit of a bad look for the town newspaper to be publishing a section written entirely in German while German forces were actively hostile against American civilians abroad, and while later young American men were being sent abroad to fight and die in one of the most brutal and bloody wars that had been fought in human history up until that point. Unfortunately, then it directly led into World War II, which was even more catastrophic. But that's just a little glimpse as to how an already established community here in Birmingham with those Germanic roots, even though there were events that were happening in World War I that were happening quite literally an entire ocean away, it had a very profound impact on how the community perceived some of these immigrants. And some of these people felt that they didn't feel safe enough, and it warranted them quite literally changing their name and adopting almost a new identity, one that was less Germanic and more American. And as far as why exactly would the Birmingham Eccentric start running a section like this in German? If you would think that there's probably a pretty decent group of people living in Birmingham that are German, if it warrants having a section in the newspaper like that. And while I don't have like concrete statistics to throw at you that can tell you, exactly how many German people or German descendants or German people lived here in Birmingham, just like I said a moment ago, it's clear that the community was big enough that there was a demand for a section of the newspaper to be written in German. Because to put quite frankly, if there were only about 3 people in the village of Birmingham asking for a German written newspaper, it probably wouldn't have warranted the effort of somebody literally going in and doing the legwork to bring it to fruition. So that was pretty much all that I have for you here tonight. And now, before I open it up for questions, I want to just remind you of a couple more things. So, we do have two more talks in this lecture series for this season. Jen mentioned this one at the beginning, but the next one is on February 8th, so the second Thursday in February, and that subject will be the civil rights movement and in the 1970s and Birmingham's Cream magazine. And that talk will be done by Caitlin Donnelly of the Birmingham Museum here. And speaking of Caitlin, she's going to get a lot of shout outs today. She actually hosts a podcast here at the Birmingham Museum. And if you're hearing that for the first time, yes, we do have a podcast, and it is called Birmingham Uncovered. You can find it on any podcast platform of your choice, or if podcast platforms aren't really your thing, we do upload it every episode to our YouTube channel. And side note, if you want to know more about the story of Edwin O'Neill, get a little bit of a deeper dive into that, Caitlin has done a podcast episode on that very subject, and I highly, highly recommend that you check it out. You'll probably laugh quite a few times if you listen to her podcast. And lastly, if you have not yet done so, you should absolutely check out our exhibit at the museum, A Tapestry of Birmingham, Exploring Our Diversity, because we'll be having it up for the remainder of this year. So all that being said, I will open up for questions now. So does anybody have any questions?
If you're more comfortable and you want to unmute, you can ask a question that way, but you can certainly throw them into the chat. We got Joe from Minneapolis. I don't have a question, but I'd say that this was very interesting and thought-provoking. Thank you. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you. Thanks for tuning in tonight. I really appreciate it.
I have a question. We always hear about Alsatians, right? Like they're German shepherds.
Yes.
But
yes.
Then they're not. Is that a?
Yes, actually, and I'm glad that you asked that because I meant to mention that, but I completely forgot. Yes, so keeping in the theme of German things in this country being changed to sound more American. Yes, we saw this very same effect with different breeds of German dogs. For instance, like some of them were rebranded to be Liberty pups or like Liberty dogs. So the same rule applied. We would generalize the term and then just add Liberty to the front. But unfortunately, while the naming convention, is kind of funny, there were instances of people actually taking out their anger and aggression on like German breeds of dogs, which is really sad to think about because like what does a dog have to do with the war that's going on thanks to Germany? Like, come on, man. But yeah, so that happened with some German breeds of dogs too. It's sort of funny, but also kind of sad.
Yeah, crazy. If you don't mind, I'm going to plug a book real quick.
Sure.
There's a really good book for those of you who are interested in that part of history and how it ties into the United States. It doesn't touch on Birmingham. It's not that tight, but American Midnight came out last year by Adam Hochschild. I always butcher his last name. He's a great historian. Anyway, it's from like 1919 to 1922. It's a really tiny part of American history, but it touches on exactly what Justin was just talking about nationwide, not Birmingham. But
I'll just add, I highly recommend looking into World War I and learning a lot about it because, like I said during the presentation, it is overlooked a lot in history. I know at least when I was in school, we really only touched on it for like maybe a day, if that. And then it was just basically a thing that you needed to get through in order to get to World War II later. But there's really a lot of interesting things that we can glean from not even just American history, but world history during the time period of World War I.
Any questions? Any comments? Anyone want to talk about World War I? Oh yes, Dead Wake. Also a great book. For those of you who are readers, Eric Larson is a nonfiction writer. He wrote Dead Wake about sinking of the Lusitania, but he writes what we refer to as narrative nonfiction, where it's nonfiction that almost reads like fiction. And yeah, Dead Wake is really good. So I'm going to piggyback on that because I studied World War I in college. So I was just so disappointed that when I learned about it, that it's exactly what Justin said. It's sort of like the Civil War. Maybe we won't have slavery anymore, and then we jump right.
And I am actually in the process of reading a book that it's a French book. It's called Au revoir là-haut, and it's written in French, but it's about World War One, and it's a historical fiction novel about two soldiers in World War One, and the very first chapter takes place the day before the armistice in November of 1918, and it talks about like the effect that the war had on these soldiers, but the entire book is basically about them trying to live their lives after they were in the war and after they both almost died during it. And it's actually really, really interesting. So
Oh wow.
highly recommend it. It is definitely translated into English, but I don't remember what the English title of it is.
If you want to, if you can remember it, throw it in the chat or shoot me an email. Maybe I can share it with everybody. That sounds fascinating. It sounds really good. There is a comment here asking you to tell us more about Old Woodward and Woodward and why why they have those
Oh,
distinctions.
good. I'm glad somebody asked about this because anytime I can complain about this, I absolutely love it. So, the reason why we have Old Woodward and Woodward today is actually because, so as you saw in that 1910 map, Old Woodward today used to be called Woodward. It was just Woodward. There were no two things. It was just Woodward. And eventually, because of the increasing car traffic that was zipping up and down Woodward Avenue between like Detroit and Pontiac, it started to get like too much for the town of Birmingham because like there was a idea thrown out there to widen the road again, and Birmingham residents were not up for that at all. They did not want that to happen because it already happened in the 20s, and they really, really did not want the road to be widened again. So what the solution to that was they made a bypass to it. And this bypass was originally called Hunter Boulevard. In fact, if you're familiar with the Birmingham area, Hunter House Hamburgers is a burger place that is on Woodward Avenue on that bypass. It's called Hunter House Hamburgers because it used to be located on Hunter Boulevard. Now, at some point, Hunter Boulevard was renamed to Woodward Avenue, and then the original Woodward became Old Woodward, and it can get sort of frustrating sometimes because sometimes you forget that you're talking about Old Woodward when they mention Woodward in an old historical document. So it's something that we see a lot here at the museum, and we always like to complain about it whenever we have the opportunity.
This is Joe Wolf in Minneapolis. I would like to jump in with one other point about that, and that's that when they created Hunter/New Woodward, they also relocated the train tracks further east. So I believe that the right of way for the train tracks was roughly where Hunter Boulevard is, and then they had to push the train tracks further east when they did Hunter. And one other piece of trivia is that they actually built the train tracks to be 4 tracks wide because before the Depression, they were planning on having 2 tracks on the outer edges for very frequent commuter rail between Pontiac and Detroit, which obviously never happened because of the growth of autos and the train. And so if you know where to look, you can see where those tracks would have been in the right of way of the train tracks, which are now on the far east side of Birmingham. So when they relocated Woodward to become New Woodward, they had to push the train tracks further east. There was just sort of a ripple effect on the east side of Birmingham.
Wow. How far east from Woodward are the train tracks, roughly? The rail line. Anybody know?
I actually do not know that off the top of my head.
No, that's weird. I live in Farmington Hills, so I don't go that far.
Yeah,
I don't go.
I live in Clarkson, so I don't usually go east of east of Woodward very often. But
I'm guessing it's probably close to a mile. I'm sort of doing the mental math in my head because the tracks in Birmingham are east of Adams Road. So I think that they're 2 blocks east of Adams at Maple. So that has to be probably in the 3/4 of a mile to a mile east of downtown.
Wow.
all I know is so all I know is I on that sort of subject, I always like to complain to people about when I'm telling them about the DUR, how I wish that still existed. That would be very useful for me. But unfortunately it doesn't. But
That's interesting.
now we have Woodward and Old Woodward, so at least I can complain about that. I like to complain about stuff.
That's a pretty big move, like almost a mile. I mean, maybe that's just what you have to do when you're, it's not the same as moving a road, moving a rail line.
To be fair, today the prospect of walking a mile sounds awful to most people because you could just get in your car and drive a mile in like 2 minutes. But back then, before you had a car, I mean, for a lot of people, that probably would have been a fairly normal thing that you would do.
Yeah, that's funny. Well, thanks, Joe. Appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
Everyone's hanging in there. I see everyone's still online. Does anyone else have anything they wanted to add? Any stories about Levinson's store? Or anyone know the Levins? All right. Well, we won't make you hang on all night. I want to thank Justin Cook for the great presentation. And thank you guys all for joining us virtually tonight. Again, we'll be back here on the 8th to hear about the civil rights movement and Cream Magazine. I'm very excited about that. And Caitlin will be doing that presentation. We'll let you guys go. Have a great night, everybody.